All right, finally getting around to using these slabs. We've got two beautiful walnut slabs here and some massive cracks and some knots, and we are gonna make a table out of these. I've never made an epoxy table before, so let's take a stab at it. It's gonna be for my own house, so I'd rather practice on my stuff than a paying customer. So how hard could it be? We're gonna take these suckers. They're like 2.25 inches thick, and I'm gonna figure out what I like. I would love to utilize these sap lines and cut straight edges along the back of that, use these sap lines, and have the river table use the sap lines going through. We're gonna build a mold. I've got some melamine, and we're gonna build out and structure a mold that we can place the slabs into, the pieces into, and then pour the epoxy in between. I will probably also seal all of the edges and seal all of the wood with a penetrating epoxy first, and that will hopefully hold in all of the bubbles. I have no idea what I'm doing. Let's do it. Here I'm using an attachment for my angle grinder called a flap disc sanding wheel. It's about 40 grit. It can be super aggressive if you're pressing hard with it, but with a light touch, this was a perfect tool for this job. For these larger cracks and fissures throughout this slab, I have decided to go with bow ties, different shapes and sizes here. I bought a starter bow tie inlay kit from Rockler, and this thing is awesome. It came with a number of these plexiglass templates that you can use with double stick tape or a clamp and place it exactly over your cracked slab, and then you can use it to hog out the actual pocket that the inlay will go in. These same stencils, you can actually cut out the bow ties themselves from the other wood. So here I'm using maple. Watch this. Oh boy. And it's super easy jig. It's from Rockler. This is not sponsored. I wish it was. Rockler, give me a call. You know my number. It worked out pretty good. Obviously, we had a little mistake there, but I always like to keep my mistakes in to show you what could go wrong. So when you're hammering those in, take it easy on them. All right, so I've got my bow tie inlays all set up on both of these slabs, and then I've struck a line for where I want to cut these in half. There's some of these cracks that are just untenable, and I'm gonna make a river table, so I don't need all of this wood. I've set it up about where I'd like it. It's gonna be an 18-inch width table. I'll keep the epoxy to at least a minimum in between these two slabs while maintaining the sap lines from the live edge from each of these boards. This one, I'm just gonna cut the hump off that other end. So the way I'm gonna do that is not with a track saw, because I don't have one, but the way I'm gonna do my poor man's track saw is the width of that is 5 inches. And so I happened to find a piece of scrap here. It's a really nice piece of scrap, mahogany, and it's 5 inches wide. So I'm gonna set this up flush with my line, and then that tells me exactly where I'm gonna clamp a straight edge, cutting a straight line all the way through. So I don't damage my bench. I'm gonna prop up some 2x4s underneath, and then I can just cut through those 2x4s as I run through it. Oh, thank you. Turtle mocha, that's so fancy. Appreciate you. My wife loves me. She just brought me a turtle mocha. How nice is that? Here in Minnesota, we have a chain of coffee shops called Caribou Coffee. I'm sure you're thinking, yeah, but what's the big deal? It's just a coffee shop. I mean, we've got Skunkin' or Charbucks on every corner, and it's, I don't know, it's tough to explain. There's a fireplace in every shop. There's deep sinking plush leather chairs and wood paneling, log cabin vibes, and the coffee tastes, I don't know, less pretentious. It's filled with salt of the earth people that are better than you, not because of the car they drive, but because they know what it's like to fight a muskie for an hour while sitting on a bucket on a frozen lake and nothing but Crocs. You know, that kind. Those kind of people. All right, so I'm finally getting around to cutting this mold. Basically, I've just taken the sheet of melamine and cut out the base and then some strips for the side. It doesn't have to be perfect, but I'm using like 3-inch sides here, just deep enough to hold the epoxy in. If there's a chance I can reuse it, that'd be great. And I heard that this tape, which is specifically built, this was from Atomic Finishes, but you can buy Tuck tape, I think, is a popular one, but I just picked this up back in the day when I knew I wanted to try one of these river tables and just hadn't gotten around to it yet. So I'm using this tape across every surface that will touch the epoxy, and hopefully that will help the mold release the epoxy without damaging the mold in case I want to do another one down the road. What I'm going to do is install these with some silicone drywall screws, and I'm just going to screw it all together. Hopefully that'll do it. Then I'm going to go around with my silicone caulking and get every corner and every seam. And a big shout out to Nicholas and Jordan over at SJN Woodworking. If you haven't followed them or checked out their stuff, go over to their channel, check some things out. They are doing absolutely fantastic work, but he helped me out with the tape to use, direction with this flex paste to stop any leaks, types of epoxy that he's used and had good luck with. Super helpful, and really appreciate all the time and energy he put into that. So appreciate your mentorship, Nicholas, and keep up the good work, beautiful work that you guys are cranking out. I'm using this specialized tape by Atomic Finishes called Bidwell Wood and Iron. I'll tag all this stuff in the description, but it worked really well to release the epoxy. It doesn't stick to this tape, and I even forgot to spray mold release in my mold, which I bought for this exact purpose, and I forgot to, and it still released really well, so I'm glad I used this tape. Here I am just dry fitting each side to make sure it fits in the mold. Everything fit nicely. And now I am mixing up the penetrating epoxy, and my son and I are going to slather up these slabs, make sure that they are nice and sealed, and then we're going to let that cure, and then we can start pouring the epoxy. But this will ensure that those bubbles that are trapped into every little nook and cranny within these slabs don't leak out into the epoxy and create a bubbly mess once that cures. Here I am putting weights onto each of the pieces of wood. This is going to hold it down, keep it from floating. I'll be able to utilize my epoxy more efficiently. I started with a thin pour of clear epoxy first, and I wanted this to be a flood coat, fill up all of the little nooks and crannies and things like that, and then the black epoxy should ideally stay exactly where I'm trying to put it within these channels. You'll notice the shims that I have under this mold. Once I put everything together, I threw a few levels on this mold and realized, because I'm in a garage, that it's sloping down slightly. So I had to get creative and shim on the front edge as well as on the right, and I wanted it left to right as well as the depth of it. So level all the way around, and that way the epoxy won't just run to one edge and fill things up. So with epoxy resin, you're always going to have some sort of rogue bubbles. The only way to pop those bubbles efficiently is with a torch or a heat gun, and it's very satisfying. So a key learning that I had on this project actually took place right after this pour. This pour was the deepest of the pours so far. From movie magic, you can't tell that I have actually been waiting about 24 hours in between each of these pours, but this one was about 1.25 inches deep, and with that much epoxy and that much chemical reaction happening, it can be very finicky to the temperatures that it's trying to cure at. And because of the chemistry and because of the cold temperatures of my garage in winter in Minnesota, it was not curing properly. After about 36 hours, it was still very gooey, and I honestly thought this whole project was ruined. I thought it was never going to cure. It was going to stay like silly putty forever, and I was going to have to start over. But I brought the entire mold into my house, put a space heater nearby, and that was able to kickstart that curing process again. And it was already much harder after 24 hours, and then began its curing process over the course of a week. Crisis averted. I was very nervous, though. Learned a lot. I mean, basically, a garage in Minnesota in the winter is not ideal for epoxy curing. What you're seeing me set up here is a makeshift router sled. It's nothing fancy. Basically just built it out of plywood scraps, 2x4 runners that I'm clamping down that I can run the sled over. And honestly, it worked really well. You can pay top dollar for these manufactured router sleds, which I'm sure are very satisfying, and they run very nicely over their ball bearings and greased rails. And for something that I absolutely needed now to be able to use with my current setup, it was easy enough to just build probably within an hour, and worked really well to flatten this thing out. A fun fact about this worn old oak workbench you're seeing under this piece, that was our dinner table, and we actually bought a veneered cheapo dinner table way back in the day when we were first starting a family, but almost immediately all the forks and tipped over glasses and children playing on it and coloring on it, the veneer started to chip away. And instead of buying a new table, I fashioned a new top out of oak boards, and it was really one of my first woodworking projects. It saved us some money when we didn't have 2 pennies to rub together. It just makes me think of when this was a blossoming interest that has now turned into a very rewarding passion of mine, woodworking, making things. It's a reminder of those simple times when I didn't have any tools, and yet I was still able to be creative, and brings me joy when I think about it. For all the little chips and dings and tiny little cracks where the epoxy is flaked out after the router experiment, I'm going to use the Boss Dog CA glue and the activator, which is going to harden up that glue almost immediately. And then I can sand it all down flush, and it's going to match my epoxy. Here I'm drilling the holes for the legs, actually for the threaded inserts, which I'm going to use to bolt the legs to. These threaded inserts I'm going to screw into their holes first so that they sort of tap the holes, and then I'm going to unscrew them, put some CA glue in there, and then screw them back in so they're nicely threaded into the wood first, but also adhered with the glue. And the bolts that I purchased for these threaded inserts are actually slightly too big for the pre-drilled holes in these legs. So I'm using a step bit here to widen all of the holes and using a little Yankee ingenuity to make sure this fits. Here I'm using Rubio Monocoat, super easy. It's like a 3-to-1 base plus a hardener, and you mix it up. You just can't screw this stuff up. It's just so easy to apply. Spread it around with a spatula. You take a white scrubby pad, like a nylon abrasive pad, and you use that to buff it in. I'm using a car polisher to buff this in at a low speed, and that worked really well.